Can you still picture those strange 1940s grocery items that vanished from the aisles forever? In the 1940s, grocery shelves carried ration substitutes and odd creations that families relied on daily, no matter how unusual they seemed. What does it say about us that such foods disappeared without a trace? Canned horse meat was one of the strangest products you could find on a 1940s grocery shelf, yet it was marketed as a smart and affordable answer to beef shortages. World War II rationing had stripped stores of familiar cuts of steak and roast, and families needed protein wherever they could get it. Horse meat was not completely unheard of in parts of Europe, but for most American households, the idea felt shocking. Still, desperation has a way of changing tastes. Wrapped in a can, it looked no different than corned beef or luncheon meat. It was inexpensive, lasted for months, and was promoted as hearty food for families trying to stretch $1 and a ration book. Grocery stores stocked it beside other staples with plain, matter-of-fact labels that did little to hide what was inside. Mothers who would never have imagined cooking horse meat before the war suddenly served it in casseroles, stews, and sandwiches. The fact that it was practical and plentiful gave it a foothold, but it never felt normal. By the late 1940s, when beef returned to shelves, most families quietly dropped the habit and never looked back. Today, the very thought of canned horse meat feels unsettling, a reminder of just how much the war changed grocery shopping and how necessity pushed people to accept the unthinkable. Margarine with color capsules may sound like a kitchen science project, but in the 1940s it was part of everyday grocery shopping. At that time, margarine was stark white, almost looking like a block of lard, because laws prevented manufacturers from selling it pre-colored to resemble butter. Instead, every package came with a small packet of yellow dye. At home, families had to knead the capsule into the margarine by hand until it turned into a golden shade close enough to pass for butter. Children were often given the job, squeezing and mixing the soft mass in a bowl, or even inside the package itself. Grocery stores promoted it as a patriotic choice, since butter was heavily rationed and dairy went to the troops. Housewives clipped recipes that used margarine in baked goods and frying pans, all while quietly wishing for the taste of real butter. The process of coloring margarine was both a chore and a ritual, a daily reminder of shortages that never seemed to end. To modern shoppers, the thought of buying a plain white block and hand-tinting it before spreading it on toast sounds bizarre. But to families of the 1940s, it was just another small sacrifice on the long road of rationing. Powdered eggs became a staple of wartime kitchens, tucked into tins and boxes that looked almost medicinal rather than appetizing. Fresh eggs were scarce, often shipped overseas to feed soldiers, and families at home had to make do with substitutes. Powdered eggs were simply dehydrated yolks and whites, mixed into a fine powder that could be rehydrated with water. Housewives whisked them into a pale yellow batter and fried them as scrambled eggs or folded them into cakes and puddings. The texture was never quite the same, often grainy and flat, but it was still protein on the table. Grocery stores sold them in bulk, sometimes with government pamphlets explaining how to use them. Children grew up eating powdered eggs without knowing what fresh eggs really tasted like, and for many, the first bite of a real fried egg after the war was unforgettable. Though they disappeared from shelves after rationing ended, the memory of powdered eggs stuck around as a symbol of both sacrifice and ingenuity. Today, they are mostly linked with camping supplies or military rations, but in the 1940s they were simply breakfast. Cabbage-flavored gelatin salads may be one of the most baffling grocery products from the 1940s, yet gelatin companies proudly advertised them as modern and nutritious. Gelatin was cheap, filling, and easy to store, making it the perfect base for inventive recipes during rationing. Magazines and grocery pamphlets encouraged homemakers to mix shredded cabbage, carrots, and even onions into lime or lemon gelatin. The result was a wobbly, translucent salad that combined sweet, sour, and savory in one dish. These molded salads often took center stage at potlucks and family dinners, displayed proudly as if their strangeness was a mark of creativity. For families tired of the same boiled vegetables, it felt like a way to dress things up, even if the taste was questionable. Children poked at the quivering shapes with forks, never sure if it was dessert or dinner. Grocery aisles stocked flavored gelatin powders by the dozens, ready to be adapted into anything the rationing cook could imagine. What feels unthinkable now was once a symbol of pride, a dish that showed you could make something fancy out of next to nothing. Canned ox tongue might sound like a dare today, but in the 1940s it was sold as a practical and respectable source of protein. Rationing pushed families to embrace cuts of meat that had once been overlooked or even avoided. Grocery stores carried tins of ox tongue alongside canned hams and corned beef, presenting it as perfectly ordinary. The meat was usually pre-cooked, sliced, and packed in brine, ready to be served cold on sandwiches or warmed in stews. For many families, it was an affordable way to put meat on the table when better cuts were gone. Its rich, chewy texture was not to everyone's liking, but recipes and community cookbooks gave ideas on how to season and serve it. Government messaging praised it as thrifty, nutritious, and patriotic, encouraging shoppers to set aside squeamishness in favor of practicality. Children often did not even realize what they were eating until much later, when the name finally registered. Today, canned ox tongue feels more like a curiosity than a grocery staple, but during the war years it was a normal, if unglamorous, part of the diet. Spam with recipe booklets was one of the defining grocery experiences of the 1940s, blending convenience with a dash of government persuasion. Spam had been around since the 1930s, but wartime rationing turned it into a cultural mainstay. Grocery stores sold tins of the pink, salty meat packed with small leaflets of recipes endorsed by government nutritionists. These recipes showed how to transform Spam into casseroles, stews, and even mock roasts, all in the name of making limited supplies stretch further. Families leaned on it heavily, and children grew up with Spam sandwiches in lunchboxes and fried Spam for dinner. For many, the recipe booklets became stained and worn from repeated use, almost like a trusted family cookbook. Though some people groaned at its monotony, Spam was reliable, cheap, and filling, qualities that mattered more than taste. When rationing eased, some families eagerly abandoned it, while others carried on the habit for years out of comfort and nostalgia. Spam may have been mocked in later decades, but in the 1940s, it was the backbone of many dinner tables. Soy-based meat extenders were an early experiment in stretching scarce resources, and they slipped quietly into grocery stores during the war. Ground beef was expensive and often unavailable, so manufacturers sold packets of soy flour to be mixed in with meat. Housewives were told it would not only make the meat last longer but also add protein and health benefits. Recipes for burgers, meatloaf, and stews suddenly came with instructions to blend in soy, sometimes in ratios that left more bean than beef. The taste was not the same, but families accepted it as a compromise. Grocery shelves carried branded boxes of extenders, sometimes right beside the beef itself, as if the two were natural partners. For children, it was simply what hamburger tasted like in those years. Many never knew their meals were being padded out until later. Soy meat extenders may not have been glamorous, but they were an important tool in keeping families fed through rationing. Looking back, they feel like a glimpse of the modern world, where plant-based substitutes are once again becoming part of everyday shopping. Victory Garden seed packets were not just a product, they were a patriotic mission sold right from the grocery aisle. Posters urged families to grow their own vegetables, and grocery stores stocked colorful packets of seeds beside the flour and canned goods. Carrots, beans, lettuce, and tomatoes were among the most popular, and entire neighborhoods planted backyard or community plots. These gardens helped relieve pressure on the national food supply while giving families fresh produce during a time when grocery shelves were thin. Children were taught to tend rows of beans and pull weeds, and the harvest became a point of pride. For many families, it was the first time they had ever grown their own food, and it created habits that lasted long after the war. Grocery stores proudly displayed the seed packets as if they were as important as bread or milk. Shoppers who bought them were told they were doing their part for victory, and that sense of contribution mattered deeply. Today, the bright vintage packets feel nostalgic, but in the 1940s they were symbols of resilience and survival. Rationed coffee in tiny tins was another stark reminder of the shortages that defined 1940s grocery shopping. Coffee beans were imported, and shipping lanes were strained by the war, making every cup precious. Grocery stores sold coffee in small cans, often limited by ration books that dictated exactly how much a family could buy. For many, the day started with a weak brew stretched with chicory or other fillers to make it last longer. Housewives carefully measured out spoons, knowing there would be no second pot if they ran short. Cafes served thinner cups, and sharing coffee became more of a ritual than a habit. The tiny tins lined store shelves, their modest size a constant reminder that luxuries had become rare. Shoppers accepted it without complaint, because coffee, even watered down, was better than none at all. When the war ended and full tins returned, the joy of that first strong cup was unforgettable. Today, seeing those small wartime tins feels both quaint and sobering, a reminder of just how little people had to live on. Corn syrup as a sugar substitute was one of the more common sights in the 1940s grocery stores, filling the gap left by sugar rationing. White granulated sugar was reserved for the troops, leaving families to rely on corn-based syrups for sweetness. Grocery shelves stocked bottles of thick, sticky syrup, often advertised for baking cakes, sweetening drinks, or pouring over pancakes. Housewives used it in pies and cookies, though the taste was never quite the same. Children grew up with candy made from corn syrup rather than sugar, developing memories of flavors that feel foreign today. Magazines carried recipes designed around the substitute, teaching cooks how to adapt old favorites to new realities. It was not glamorous, but it was affordable, plentiful, and dependable. Grocery stores stacked it high, knowing shoppers had little choice. Once sugar returned, many families happily abandoned the syrup, but for a time it was a fixture in nearly every kitchen. Looking back, it is both strange and fascinating to imagine a world where the sweetness of everyday life depended on corn syrup instead of sugar. Carrot marmalade was one of the more creative solutions to sugar and fruit shortages, and it actually earned a place on many 1940s breakfast tables. Oranges and citrus fruit were hard to come by, but carrots were plentiful and easy to grow in Victory Gardens. Grocery stores and magazines promoted recipes that boiled carrots with sugar substitutes and flavorings like lemon essence to mimic the tang of orange marmalade. Some families swore it tasted just as good as the real thing, while others admitted it was only bearable because there was no alternative. The bright orange color also fooled the eye, making it feel more like a familiar treat than a desperate substitution. The result was a sweet, bright spread with a surprisingly fruity taste, even though it was made from vegetables. Children often did not know the difference, spreading it on toast or biscuits as if it were the real thing. Housewives liked it because it kept well, used ingredients they already had, and gave families a sense of normalcy at the table. Grocery shelves stocked jars of pre-made carrot marmalade alongside instructions for making your own at home. It may sound odd now, but at the time it was seen as thrifty and even patriotic, another example of turning simple vegetables into something greater. When rationing ended, carrot marmalade faded back into obscurity, but for those who grew up with it, the taste was unforgettable. Canned kidney stew was part of the broader push to make offal meats a regular part of the American diet during rationing. Prime cuts of beef were reserved for soldiers, leaving families with hearts, livers, and kidneys. Grocery companies packaged kidney stew in tins, ready to be heated and served over rice or potatoes. Advertisements emphasized its richness and nutrition, framing it as an affordable luxury in disguise. Yet many families cooked it with extra onions or herbs, hoping to soften the strong flavor that kids often rejected. The taste was strong and earthy, not something every child loved, but it was filling and cheap. Cookbooks and pamphlets encouraged families to embrace these cans as hearty and nourishing, even if they carried a stigma of being second-rate. Grocery shelves stacked them proudly beside corned beef hash and Spam, and for many families they were just another way to get protein without spending precious ration points. Though rarely remembered today, canned kidney stew was once an ordinary sight, a reminder that people ate what was available, not necessarily what they wanted. Dried milk powder, often branded under names like Klim, was a lifeline in a world where fresh milk was scarce. Packaged in tins, it was sold both to soldiers overseas and to families trying to manage at home. Mothers used it for everything from morning cereal to baking, mixing the powder with water to create a pale imitation of fresh milk. Some women mixed it with a spoonful of sugar or vanilla just to make it more tolerable for children. Despite its bland taste, it was still considered a miracle for households that otherwise had no dairy at all. Grocery stores stocked rows of it, with government posters praising its nutritional value. Children often wrinkled their noses at the taste, but it was a dependable source of calcium and protein. It also kept well, a major advantage when refrigeration was not always available. For homemakers, dried milk became essential, even if it was never truly loved. After rationing ended, it slowly retreated from everyday grocery shelves, leaving behind a legacy of practicality rather than fond memories. Victory canned soups were another wartime grocery innovation, filling shelves with strange combinations that stretched ingredients. Companies produced tins of soup that used barley, beets, turnips, and other cheap fillers in place of scarce meat. Grocery stores promoted them as hearty and thrifty, with labels featuring patriotic slogans and simple cooking tips. Some labels even carried instructions on how to thin the soup with water to serve larger families. Others encouraged adding leftover vegetables or grains at home, turning one can into a whole pot. Families bought them because they were affordable, filling, and easy to prepare after long days of work or factory shifts. Children might not have been excited to see beet soup at the table, but it kept them warm and full. These soups were part of the broader Victory branding push that encouraged every purchase to feel like a contribution to the war effort. Today, they seem unusual, but in the 1940s, they were a comforting reminder that even in lean times, a hot meal could be found in a can. Spam-flavored loaf variations were one of the stranger spin-offs that briefly lined 1940s shelves. Companies experimented with versions like Spam and macaroni loaf, Spam and cheese loaf, and even Spam with beans pressed into a block. These were sold as convenient, ready-to-slice meals that needed no extra cooking. Promotional pamphlets claimed they offered variety for the tired wartime table, but many shoppers found the mixes rubbery and unappealing. Even loyal Spam fans admitted that the add-ins made it less appetizing rather than more. Grocery stores stacked them beside regular Spam, hoping shoppers would welcome variety in their weekly rations. But the flavors were often odd, the texture heavy, and many families tried them once before returning to plain Spam. Advertisements promised new tastes and easier meals, yet the reality was closer to gimmick than necessity. By the late 1940s, most of these spin-offs had quietly disappeared, remembered only as a footnote in the history of canned meat. Raisin pie, filling in cans, became a common sight when fresh fruit was too scarce to rely on. Raisins, dried and shelf-stable, were promoted as a stand-in for apples, cherries, and other fruits that could no longer be imported easily. Many recipes suggested boiling the canned filling with spices to make it richer, giving families the illusion of a homemade pie. Some even added vinegar or lemon peel to balance the sweetness and create a sharper flavor. Grocery stores carried cans of pre-spiced raisin pie filling, ready to be poured into a crust and baked. Housewives clipped recipes that called for it in cookies, puddings, and even savory sauces. Children got used to the deep, sticky sweetness, even if they longed for the tartness of a real apple pie. For many families, it became a holiday staple, bringing a taste of tradition when options were slim. Though raisin pie has largely disappeared from modern kitchens, in the 1940s it was a reminder that ingenuity could turn even dried fruit into something festive. Dried bean meatloaf mix was one of the more unusual grocery products of the decade, offering a vegetarian-style substitute long before such things were fashionable. Packaged mixes of beans, breadcrumbs, and seasonings were sold as complete alternatives to ground beef. Advertisements promised that once baked, the loaf would slice and serve just like real meatloaf, making it perfect for family dinners. Housewives quickly learned it was more about filling bellies than fooling anyone's taste buds. Housewives were told they could prepare it the same way they would a regular meatloaf, shaping and baking it into a hearty family dinner. The flavor was earthy and filling, but it was not fooling anyone into thinking it was beef. Grocery stores pushed it heavily during the peak of rationing, and magazines praised it as both nutritious and thrifty. For families who could not afford or find real meat, it was a lifesaver. For others, it was a reminder of just how far from normal grocery shopping had become. Dried prune whip mix may sound like a punishment today, but in the 1940s it was pitched as a light and healthy dessert. Chocolate was hard to come by, but prunes were cheap, abundant, and easy to dry. Grocery companies sold powdered mixes that only needed water and a good beating to transform into a fluffy, sweet whip. Mothers were told it looked elegant in a glass dish, almost like a mousse you would find in an upscale restaurant. The reality was that it often tasted more medicinal than indulgent, but families ate it gratefully. Families spooned it into bowls as if it were mousse, sometimes topping it with whatever cream substitute they could find. Children often accepted it without question, because sweets of any kind were a treat during the war. Grocery stores stocked prune whip alongside other dried fruit products, and advertisements promised it was both tasty and good for digestion. When chocolate returned after the war, prune whip mixes quickly lost their place. But for a time, they were the closest many families got to dessert. Molasses, as an everyday sweetener, became the backbone of many grocery lists during the sugar shortages of the 1940s. Jars of thick, dark syrup filled store shelves, promoted as an affordable, nutritious replacement. Housewives stirred it into coffee, drizzled it on bread, and used it to sweeten cakes and cookies. Teachers even encouraged children to eat molasses sandwiches at school, calling it a healthy habit during rationing. For many kids, the sticky taste of molasses on white bread became one of the defining flavors of their childhood. Its strong, earthy flavor was not subtle, but it became familiar to a whole generation of children. Recipes in magazines often suggested molasses as the main sweetener, turning necessity into habit. For families who missed the light sweetness of sugar, it was an acquired taste. Still, it was dependable, plentiful, and patriotic. Everything a wartime ingredient was expected to be. Once sugar returned, molasses faded back to a niche role, but in the 1940s it was an everyday staple. Canned sardine sandwich spread was a curious product that blended thrift with convenience. Sardines were cheap, high in protein, and easy to preserve, making them perfect for rationing times. Grocery companies pureed them into spreads, seasoning them lightly so they could be spread directly onto bread or crackers. Some recipes suggested mixing it with mayonnaise or chopped pickles to soften the flavor and make it more appealing. Families that lived near the coast often embraced it, while inland households were slower to accept its strong taste. Housewives appreciated the ease of preparing quick lunches without wasting meat rations. Children were not always enthusiastic. The fishy taste was strong, but it kept families fed. Grocery stores displayed jars and tins of the spread alongside other sandwich fillers like peanut butter and pimento cheese. Though it never became a beloved staple, it was practical, cheap, and easy. Today, it feels more like a relic of necessity than a recipe anyone would revive. Wartime utility cheese blocks were a strange but unavoidable sight on grocery shelves in the 1940s, each one wrapped in plain paper stamped only with a government label. There was no fancy brand name, no colorful logo, and no attempt to make it seem like anything other than what it was: functional cheese, rationed and distributed for the sake of efficiency. Families would bring it home, slice into its dense, waxy texture, and use it sparingly across meals. Unlike the cheeses we see today with endless flavors and marketing campaigns, utility cheese was a product stripped down to its most basic role: calories and protein in a block. Housewives melted it into sauces, grated it onto vegetables, or stirred it into casseroles to stretch thin meat portions. Children, who might have been too young to know what cheddar or Swiss was supposed to taste like, simply accepted it as cheese. Grocery stores stocked it in bulk, making sure each household got only the amount their ration book allowed. For many families, it was the only cheese they saw for months at a time. Government pamphlets suggested cheerful recipes, but everyone knew it was about survival, not flavor. When rationing ended, branded cheeses quickly reappeared, and utility blocks faded from memory. Yet for those who lived through it, the image of a plain brown wrapper stamped with a bold black utility label is unforgettable. It stood as a reminder of a world where food was never about choice, but about making do. Dried apple slices in boxes became one of the most dependable grocery items during the 1940s, offering a taste of fruit when fresh produce was scarce or too expensive. Packed tightly in cardboard boxes or paper sacks, the slices were chewy, leathery, and sweet, with a concentrated flavor that made them ideal for pies, puddings, and snacks. Housewives soaked them in water overnight, reviving them into a passable substitute for fresh apples in desserts. Grocery stores promoted them heavily, sometimes stacking them beside bags of raisins or prunes, all part of the dried fruit industry that boomed under rationing. Children often ate them straight from the box, gnawing on tough slices as if they were candy. School lunches might include a handful wrapped in wax paper, offering both energy and comfort in a time when fresh apples were rare treats. The boxes often carried simple branding, boasting about vitamins and health benefits to assure mothers that their children were not missing out on nutrition. Though they lacked the crisp bite of a fresh apple, dried slices carried a kind of homely charm, a sense of thrift and resourcefulness that fit perfectly with the wartime spirit. When apple orchards recovered and shipping improved, these dried slices began to fade from everyday grocery baskets. Still, for those who lived through the shortages, the sight of a cardboard box full of wrinkled fruit was enough to stir memories of both hunger and ingenuity. Evaporated milk. Baby formula kits were a curious and slightly unsettling part of 1940s grocery displays. Fresh milk was often unavailable or rationed, and infant formula as we know it today had not yet been developed into a reliable mass-market product. The solution was to package cans of evaporated milk alongside small instruction booklets and sugar packets, teaching mothers how to mix their own formula at home. Grocery stores presented these kits as practical, patriotic, and even modern, assuring families that babies would thrive just as well on them as they would on fresh dairy. The process usually involved mixing evaporated milk with water and adding sugar or corn syrup to create a thin, sweet liquid. Mothers carefully followed the instructions, often boiling the mixture to make sure it was safe. Doctors and government pamphlets endorsed the practice, presenting it as a standard alternative during shortages. For many infants of the 1940s, this improvised formula was their first taste of nourishment beyond the breast. The cans were stacked neatly on shelves, a reminder of both resourcefulness and the limits of what was possible at the time. To modernize, the idea of feeding babies a mixture of canned milk and sugar seems questionable, even alarming. Yet, it was a product of necessity, born of a world where families had to trust in whatever was available. These kits symbolize a time when the line between grocery shopping and survival blurred in the most intimate way. Turnip flour bread mixes were one of the strangest wartime innovations to appear in grocery stores, proof that desperation could turn almost anything into a loaf. With wheat flour tightly rationed, companies looked for alternatives, and root vegetables like turnips became a surprising substitute. Grocery shelves carried boxes of bread mix that promised a fresh-baked loaf using ground turnip flour blended with small amounts of wheat. The result was dense, earthy, and often bitter, but families baked it anyway because bread of any kind was precious. Housewives added molasses or dried fruit to mask the taste, while others sliced it thin and toasted it to make it more palatable. Government pamphlets praised it as an example of ingenuity, a way to turn underused crops into daily staples. Children often pushed it aside, longing for the soft white bread they remembered before rationing. Grocery advertisements framed it as a patriotic choice, another small sacrifice made for the greater good. For many, the loaves became symbols of how far from normal life the war had pushed the dinner table. Once wheat flour returned, turnip bread disappeared almost overnight, surviving only in the memories of those who had no choice but to eat it. Today, it feels like one of the more bizarre experiments in food history, a reminder that in hard times, even the humblest root could be pressed into service. Powdered gelatin desserts with vegetables were perhaps the most bewildering products promoted in grocery ads of the 1940s. Gelatin itself was not new, but the ways it was marketed during wartime turned it into something far stranger than the fruity jellies we know today. With fresh produce scarce and meals often monotonous, advertisers encouraged homemakers to create salads that combined lime or lemon gelatin with shredded celery, olives, cabbage, or even fish. Grocery stores stocked gelatin powders in bright boxes, and magazines filled their pages with glossy photos of shimmering green molds packed with vegetables. The pitch was that these dishes were modern, thrifty, and elegant, the perfect way to stretch ingredients and make meals feel exciting. Families dutifully tried them, often serving the jiggling creations at Sunday dinners or potlucks. Children poked suspiciously at the wobbly molds, never sure if they were supposed to be dessert or a side dish. Housewives sometimes admitted they hated the taste but made them anyway because it was what the ads and recipe books said was fashionable. For some, the novelty wore off quickly, but for others, these gelatin salads became a staple of wartime and even post-war cooking. Grocery stores leaned into the trend, stocking molds and pamphlets that promised endless variations. Today, the idea of mixing olives and gelatin seems unthinkable, but in the 1940s, it was a symbol of resourcefulness dressed up as elegance. These bizarre creations reflect both the constraints and the creativity of an era when nothing went to waste, not even dessert. Canned horsemeat stew was one of the most controversial and strange protein sources of the 1940s. Beef was in short supply, but horses were plentiful, and some companies began quietly selling canned horsemeat as stew. For many, the very idea was unsettling, but wartime hunger softened resistance. Ads framed it as a noble choice, with slogans like, "Every bite helps the fight," trying to make eating horse feel patriotic. In some areas, butchers openly sold horse cuts, though they were labeled carefully to avoid scaring buyers. Those who ate it often avoided telling neighbors, embarrassed by the stigma. Ads promoted it as affordable, hearty, and patriotic, encouraging families to see it as just another type of meat. In truth, it was stringy, tough, and carried a flavor most Americans did not embrace. Yet in some areas, especially on the West Coast, canned horse meat found a market. Families who tried it rarely admitted it, but the tins sold steadily enough to be remembered. Once the war ended and beef returned to shelves, horse meat vanished almost overnight. It remains one of the strangest chapters in American grocery history. Pinto beans by the pound were always the secret weapon. $1 could get you a bag that made a pot big enough to feed a family for days. You soaked them, seasoned them, and served them with rice, tortillas, or cornbread. Now that same bag is closer to $2 or even $3 in some stores. And the big bulk bags? Not much cheaper by comparison. Beans were supposed to be immune. They were humble, practical, honest food. Now they are quietly climbing up the price ladder. And when even dry beans start to feel expensive, it makes you nervous. Because beans were the plan when the plan failed. And if those cost too much, what is left? Plain white rice pudding cups were the quiet dessert no one bragged about, but everyone seemed to eat. They came chilled, sealed with foil, and tasted like soft, sweetened memory. They were thick, creamy, and filled with tiny grains of rice that reminded you food did not have to be loud to be good. It was the kind of dessert that made you sit down, take a spoon, and actually pay attention. The cinnamon on top, when it was there, added just enough to make it feel like something made with care. You never asked for rice pudding, but when it was there, you always ate it. Some came from the store in those little 4-packs wrapped in cardboard. Others came from home, made from leftover rice and sweetened milk, poured into Tupperware. It was humble, but it was honest. And it reminded you that dessert did not have to be perfect, it just had to be present. It filled the space between meals with warmth. It closed the night on a soft note. Rice pudding cups did not sparkle. But in the 1970s, they delivered comfort without trying too hard. And sometimes that was exactly what we needed. If any of this reminded you of what used to sit on your shelf, or what still might, share your favorite memory in the comments, tap like if it brought you back, and subscribe so we can keep unpacking the past together. There was no freedom quite like a bike in the 1970s. No schedule, no helmet, Just you and your rusted 10-speed flying down the sidewalk like you had somewhere to be. You did not. That was the point. You pedaled to the store for gum, to your friend's house just to hang. You rode in packs, racing down hills, throwing your hands in the air like Evel Knievel. Nobody tracked your location. Your parents did not panic if you disappeared for a few hours. Be home by dark, they said. So you kept one eye on the sun, one on the road, and hoped you made it back before the streetlights flickered on. It was pure, unsupervised childhood. Scraped knees, popped tires, cardboard in the spokes to make it sound like a motorcycle. Sometimes your bike broke down and you just walked it the rest of the way, talking about everything and nothing with whoever stuck by you. It was never about the destination. It was about how far you could go before someone called you home. You were not just riding a bike. You were becoming your own person. Every block was yours to conquer. Every shortcut became a story. In the 1970s, your bike was your first taste of independence, and maybe your last for a while. And as the sun dipped low and you coasted into the driveway, you felt bigger than you were. That kind of freedom, you never really forget it. Glass peanut butter jars reused as cups were another trademark of poor family kitchens. Brands like Skippy and Jif often sold their spreads in heavy glass containers that doubled as drinking glasses once emptied. Mothers washed them out carefully, peeled off the labels, and suddenly you had a set of sturdy cups. Kool-Aid, sweet tea, or plain tap water tasted just as good out of a peanut butter jar as it did out of any fancy glassware. Some jars even came with printed designs, cartoon characters, or logos that made them more fun than anything store-bought. Kids claimed their favorites, and God help you if a sibling drank out of your peanut butter glass. They rattled in dish racks, thick enough to survive endless drops, and often outlived real glasses that broke in a year. Families never wasted money on drinkware when they were essentially handed out for free at the grocery store. They were heavy, practical, and often mismatched, but that was part of their charm. Guests drank from them without complaint because everyone had them, and everyone understood. In poor households of the 1970s, those jars were proof that nothing useful ever went to waste. Mock banana extract was a curious invention that speaks volumes about shortages in the 1940s. With imported bananas cut off during the war, Americans had to say goodbye to their favorite tropical fruit. But clever chemists came up with a substitute, flavoring made from plants like fig or banana squash, bottled and sold as mock banana extract. It was meant for baking, so pies, cakes, and puddings could still carry a hint of banana taste, even if no bananas were in sight. The flavor was strange, sharp, and not quite right, but for families desperate to hold on to familiar recipes, it became a fixture in pantries. Homemakers swapped tips on how to blend it with sugar or vanilla to mask the odd aftertaste. Children who grew up with it often said it tasted fake once they finally had a real banana again. Still, in its moment, it was a small miracle, something to bridge the gap between loss and normalcy. Today, the idea of fake banana made from fig extract sounds odd, but back then, it was a strange solution to a very real problem. Frozen fish sticks were once a weeknight hack. You could feed the family, serve them with fries, and still come in under budget. The box was big, the sticks were crispy-ish, and no one asked what kind of fish it actually was. You dipped it in ketchup or tartar sauce and called it done. That box that used to cost $3? It is closer to $7 now. And the sticks are smaller, thinner, more breading, less fish. Even the bargain brands have gone up. And it is not like anyone thought frozen fish sticks were top-tier cuisine. They were there for the nights when you had no energy, no plan, and no money. But now, they are part of the inflation club. You still eat them, you still sort of enjoy them, but you cannot ignore the price anymore. Even fake fish got expensive. Canned applesauce was dessert, side dish, and lunchbox filler all in one. It came in big cans, small cans, even plastic cups toward the end of the decade. It was smooth, sweet, and slightly tangy, and always better cold. You served it with pork chops, spooned it into bowls, or spread it on toast. Sometimes it was cinnamon-flavored, sometimes plain, but always familiar. It was fruit that required no peeling, no chewing, and no mess. You stirred it before serving because the water always rose to the top. It came out in a soft plop and sat in the bowl like a scoop of mashed fruit. It cooled your tongue after hot meals and added sweetness to otherwise dull plates. Sometimes it was the only thing on the plate that felt like dessert. You never got excited about it, but you always finished it. Kids loved it. Adults used it. It was dependable. Canned applesauce was one of those foods that never tried to do too much, but always gave just enough. Bologna ends from the deli were the mystery meat of childhood in poor households. At the end of the slicer's work, when the big log of Bologna was too short to fit properly, the store sold the leftover ends at a discount. Families lined up for them, taking home bags of odd-shaped chunks. They were fried in a skillet, stacked between bread, or diced into casseroles. Sometimes the slices were thick and uneven, curling up in the pan like little cups of grease. Other times they were mashed into sandwiches with mustard, a meal that felt like a feast even though it cost pennies. Kids complained, but they ate every bite because meat was meat and Bologna was king in a poor kitchen. Families stretched those ends as far as they could, using every scrap in lunches and dinners. It was cheap, salty, and filling, which was all that mattered. Today, it might seem funny, but for kids in the 1970s, the taste of fried Bologna ends was unforgettable. Powdered gelatin desserts in odd flavors became another strange feature of the wartime pantry. While fruit-flavored gelatin had long been popular, the 1940s introduced savory flavors like tomato, celery, or even chicken. These powders were marketed as creative ways to stretch meals, turning leftovers into molded salads or aspics. Government pamphlets even included recipes for gelatin meat salads, showing off peas, carrots, and even hot dogs floating in wobbly shapes. Magazines praised them as thrifty, modern, and attractive, though many families quietly dreaded serving them. Children in particular were baffled, expecting dessert but finding vegetables inside. Homemakers were encouraged to suspend vegetables, meat scraps, or even fish inside jiggling blocks of gelatin, creating bizarre dishes that baffled children and guests alike. The idea was efficiency, nothing wasted, everything served. Cookbooks filled with recipes for salads that combined gelatin with mayonnaise, peas, and carrots, insisting they were both nutritious and elegant. In truth, they were strange, often unappetizing, and today they are remembered mostly as culinary curiosities. Few recipes from this gelatin craze survived beyond the wartime years, but the memory of tomato-flavored gelatin lingers as one of the oddest items ever sold in grocery stores. Margarine in a tub was the cheaper answer to butter, and for a long time it stayed in its lane. It spread easily, kept forever in the fridge, and came in tubs big enough to last all month. You could bake with it, fry eggs in it, melt it over vegetables, or slather it onto toast. Some people swore by it. Others just could not afford anything else. Either way, it got the job done. For years, you could get a whole tub for under $1. Now that same tub is pushing $3, and if you go for a buttery spread or something with olive oil, forget it. You are still getting oil and flavoring, but paying like it is whipped gold. The ingredients have not changed, but the price sure has. The basic brands that once saved you money are now neck and neck with store-brand butter, and that makes it harder to justify. For a while, margarine felt like a recession-proof staple, something you could count on in lean times. But today, it feels like you are being charged more for settling. It still lives in fridges across America, but now it comes with a side of frustration. When even margarine feels expensive, you start to wonder what cheap even means anymore. Carnation. Instant breakfast was marketed as nutrition in a glass, but poor kids knew it mostly as a sugar rush before school. The powder was mixed into milk, promising vitamins, minerals, and energy, but mostly tasting like chocolate milk with extra grit. Parents loved it because it was fast and cheap, filling kids up in minutes. The powder never fully dissolved, leaving clumps at the bottom of the glass that kids stirred endlessly with spoons. Strawberry, vanilla, or chocolate, all of them packed with sweetness that got you out the door buzzing. Mothers bought it in bulk, convinced it was a healthy shortcut, even if it was closer to dessert than breakfast. For kids, it was better than cereal some mornings, and for parents, it was one less thing to worry about. Today, people laugh at the idea of calling it instant nutrition. But in the 1970s, Carnation instant breakfast was a grocery item every poor kid remembered with a mix of nostalgia and sugar-coated energy. Soy Victory sausage was one of the strangest meats to line shelves during the 1940s. With real meat in short supply, companies blended soy flour, fillers, and scraps into sausages that were meant to stretch rations further. These sausages often looked the part, but once cooked, they revealed their odd texture and flavor. Many described them as rubbery or bland, but they were cheap and filling, and that mattered more than taste. The government promoted them as patriotic, urging families to embrace soy as a way to help win the war. Cookbooks included recipes that added onions, breadcrumbs, or herbs to improve the flavor. Families learned to slice them into casseroles or stews where the strangeness could be hidden. For many, it was their first real exposure to soy as food, and it stuck in memory as both peculiar and necessary. Soy sausages never became a beloved staple, but they were a symbol of sacrifice at the dinner table. Store-brand American cheese singles were the cheapest cheese you could buy. Plastic-wrapped slices that melted like magic and turned any sandwich into comfort food. You used them on grilled cheese, cheeseburgers, or even scrambled eggs if you were in a mood. You used to get 20 slices for under $2. Now the same pack costs over $4 and feels thinner than ever. It tears when you peel it, it sweats when it is warm. But you still buy it because it makes the food feel like home. You stand in the aisle comparing slices, wondering if it is worth going generic again. Spoiler: even the generics are not cheap anymore. Cheese singles used to be filler food. Now they are another reason your grocery total feels like rent. Coffee cans for storing flour or sugar were a sight you could find on any kitchen counter. Once the last spoonful of Maxwell House or Folgers was brewed, the metal can was scrubbed clean and filled with dry goods. The plastic snap-on lid kept everything fresh enough, and the can itself was nearly indestructible. Poor families stacked them on shelves, labeled with masking tape and marker to tell sugar from flour, rice, or cornmeal. No matter how many times they were washed, they always carried that lingering coffee smell, which sometimes flavored the flour if it sat too long. But nobody minded. It was thrift in action, and that mattered more than taste. Kids grew up recognizing the sound of those plastic lids popping open as part of the rhythm of cooking at home. They doubled as storage for nails, screws, crayons, or buttons, making them as much workshop and craft supplies as kitchenware. Lined up in neat rows, they became a badge of pride, practical, reused, and full of possibility. Buying new canisters was out of the question when every household already had a pile of coffee cans ready to go. Victory Coffee Substitute was a bitter reminder of shortages made from roasted chicory root, barley, or other grains. Real coffee beans were scarce, and Americans had to accept that their morning cup would not taste the same. Grocery shelves stocked jars of this substitute, advertised as rich and satisfying, though few agreed. Some ads even claimed it was healthier than coffee, boasting that it was easy on the nerves and ideal for families. Homemakers were encouraged to brew it proudly, as though drinking it was a patriotic duty. For many, it became less about taste and more about keeping up a comforting ritual. Many said it tasted burnt or earthy, with none of the warmth that real coffee provided. Still, it gave people something hot to drink, and the ritual mattered more than the taste. Families drank it with milk or sweetened it with precious sugar to mask the bitterness. Some soldiers overseas grew used to it and drank it even after the war, but most abandoned it the moment real coffee returned. Victory coffee substitutes were strange, unwelcome, and unforgettable, tied forever to the sacrifices of the 1940s. Hot dogs in bulk packs were never glamorous, but they were survival food. A 10-pack could stretch across multiple meals, especially if you had buns or just bread. You boiled them, grilled them, nuked them. Kids ate them cold out of the fridge, and they used to be cheap, really cheap. Now even basic hot dogs have seen a price jump. Some packs are nearing $6, and the bigger family sizes do not save much anymore. And if you want anything fancier than the pink tube kind, be ready to fork over almost 10. Hot dogs were supposed to be recession-proof, that thing you could always afford. Toss a pack in the cart, dinner was done. Now they are joining bacon in the "is it worth it" category. For better or worse, even hot dogs are starting to feel like a treat. Plastic butter tubs in the fridge were the universal sign of a poor kid's household in the 1970s. No family on a budget had real Tupperware stacked neatly in their refrigerator. It was always country crock, parquet, or blue bonnet tubs that had long since been emptied of margarine. The minute you lifted one out, you knew it was a gamble. You might get mashed potatoes, beans, leftover chili, or the dreaded mystery stew your mom had made by tossing in whatever was left from the week. Kids everywhere knew the disappointment of reaching for what you thought was butter for your toast, only to open the lid and find green beans floating in broth. These tubs never sealed perfectly, so the fridge often carried a faint smell of onions and gravy. Yet families swore by them because they were free, durable, and endlessly reusable. They stacked easily in cupboards filled with everything from lunches to cookies for road trips. Taking potato salad to a picnic? You brought it in a butter tub. Nobody batted an eye because that was normal. The bright yellow lids became part of the scenery of poor kitchens everywhere, reminding kids that when you had little, you made the most of everything. Cream of mushroom soup used to be the unsung hero of 1,000 casseroles. It was not something you ate on its own, but it was the base of every budget recipe your mom made from a church cookbook. You poured it into green beans, poured it over rice, or mixed it into tuna noodles and called it dinner. Back then, it was under $1, always. Now, closer to $2, and that is if you are lucky. Some stores price it like it is homemade French bisque. You used to toss 3 or 4 into the cart without thinking. Now you scan the shelf and hope for a 2-for-1 deal. And it is not just mushroom, cream of chicken, celery, broccoli. They are all climbing like they forgot who they were feeding. For generations, these soups were budget stretchers. They glued together ingredients that had no business being called a meal. But now they are part of the problem. Casseroles just got more expensive. Dehydrated soup bricks were another strange but practical item from wartime grocery stores. These compressed cubes or rectangles contained dried vegetables, bouillon, and grains, ready to be boiled into soup. They were promoted as a miracle of convenience. Just drop one into water and dinner was served. Some even came with patriotic names like Victory Soup, promising both comfort and efficiency. Community cookbooks suggested adding scraps of onion, potatoes, or cabbage to make the broth heartier. For many families, these bricks became a way to turn almost nothing into something that could feed a crowd. The texture and taste were far from gourmet, but families welcomed the ease. They often added scraps of meat, potatoes, or garden vegetables to bulk up the meal. Children remembered the bricks dissolving into murky broth with an odd smell, but it was warm and filling. For soldiers and civilians alike, they became a familiar staple. Today we have instant soup powders and packaged mixes, but the old bricks feel almost medieval. They were practical, strange, and a symbol of a world learning to stretch every resource. Evaporated milk used to be a poor man's secret weapon. It sat right there next to the condensed stuff, in a small metal can with a price tag you barely noticed. You kept a few in the cupboard for emergencies, or baking, or when there was no fresh milk in the fridge and the store was too far or too expensive. Back then, a can cost less than a candy bar. Today, you might be better off just buying real milk. It was used in coffee, poured over cereal, and stirred into mashed potatoes, and somehow, it worked. You could stretch it with water or use it full strength when you needed extra creaminess. It was cheap comfort, quiet, overlooked, and always there when the fridge let you down. Now it sits on the shelf with a price tag that makes you double-check if you grabbed the wrong brand. That once cost less than 50 cents is flirting with $2 in some stores. It is not flashy, it is not trendy. But for people who grew up on it, evaporated milk still holds a place in the pantry and in the budget, even if it pinches now. Puffed rice or puffed wheat cereal was another grocery item poor kids could not forget. It came in giant plastic bags, so big they barely fit into the pantry. The cereal itself was bland, light, and tasted like cardboard without help, but it was cheap and lasted forever. Mothers dumped heaps of sugar on top just to make it palatable, turning breakfast into a half-sweet, half-grain ritual. Kids would crunch through mountains of it, sometimes soggy, sometimes stale, but always there in the morning. The sound of that oversized bag crinkling was part of every poor family's kitchen soundtrack. It did not come in colorful boxes with prizes or mascots, but it filled bellies for pennies. Families bought it by the sack because it stretched across countless mornings. Looking back, it might not have been anyone's favorite, but it was dependable, and every poor kid remembered it. Instant mashed potatoes used to be the cheapest way to fake real comfort. Just add water, maybe some butter, and suddenly you had a side dish that looked like dinner came together on purpose. They were shelf-stable, family-sized, and cheap. $1 or less for a box that lasted weeks. Now those same boxes are $2 or $3, and the portion sizes have somehow shrunk while the price tags grew. Even store brands have edged up into "wait, what?" territory. And that is not even counting the loaded kinds with cheese or bacon flavoring. They are practically deluxe now. For people who used to grab 3 boxes without blinking, that is a shift. It means thinking twice about something you once relied on, something that filled your plate when there was not much else to serve. Sure, they are still fast, still easy, still kind of taste like cardboard fluff, but the good kind. But now they are a backup plan with a budget. Even fake potatoes are not cheap anymore. Cabbage and potatoes by the sack were the backbone of poor family meals. Sold in bulk for cheap, they could be stretched into soups, stews, or fried up for dinner. Bags of potatoes sat in cool basements, while cabbage heads lingered in the fridge for weeks without spoiling. Every meal seemed to find a way to use them, boiled, mashed, fried, or shredded into coleslaw. Kids groaned when cabbage smell filled the house, but parents knew it was hearty, filling, and nutritious. Sometimes it was all you had, but it was enough to keep everyone going. In winter especially, potatoes and cabbage carried families through when money was thin. They were humble, unglamorous foods, but they held a place of honor in poor households. Every poor kid in the 1970s remembered those giant sacks, knowing dinner would almost always include one or both. Store-brand peanut butter crackers were the kind of snack that showed up when lunch was still a few hours away. They came in little plastic sleeves, bright orange crackers, sandwiching a thin layer of slightly sweet, slightly salty peanut butter. You could buy a box of 6 packs for under $1, and they lasted all week if you were careful. They were crumbly, dry, and left peanut butter in the corners of your mouth. But you never said no to them. They were the treat tucked into a lunchbox when cookies were out of reach. You ate them slow, one bite at a time, trying to make them last, or you scarfed them down fast because hunger had no patience. Some broke in the package. Some were perfect, but everyone counted. They were the in-between snack that got you through school days, grocery trips, or waiting for dinner to be done. You never thought of them as luxury, but looking back, they were one of the most dependable little things in your pantry. Peanut butter crackers did not make a meal, but they gave you just enough to keep going. Powdered eggs were one of the most common and strange staples of the 1940s, sold in tins or cardboard boxes as a substitute for fresh eggs. With real eggs sent overseas to soldiers or rationed down to almost nothing, families had to find a way to keep breakfast on the table. Enter powdered eggs, which looked like pale yellow dust and were meant to be whisked with water until they resembled the texture of a cracked egg. They did not taste the same, of course, and many people remembered the chalky flavor with a wince. Still, the government promoted them heavily, assuring homemakers that they could scramble, bake, and cook with them almost as if nothing had changed. Families learned to make do, folding them into cakes, stirring them into batters, or bulking them up with milk and herbs to hide the flavor. Kids knew the difference, but hunger made them eat anyway. These tins became as common in pantries as flour and sugar, proving how much rationing shaped daily life. Today, it is nearly impossible to find powdered eggs on grocery shelves. but in the 1940s, they were a lifeline. So tell me, which of these forgotten grocery items would you have dared to try? And if you enjoyed this trip back in time, drop your thoughts in the comments, give this video a like, and subscribe so we can keep uncovering the strangest shelves of history together.